Mr. President, I want to speak to the bill that's before the Senate right now, and also to an amendment that I would like to have voted on as a part of the underlying legislation. But I do want to also react to some of the remarks that were made by my colleague from Vermont, and simply say that when it comes to some of the legislation that's trying to be jammed through the Congress this year, yeah, we believe that it's okay to say no to some things. We think it's okay to say no, for example, to 1,500-page bills that are written behind closed doors in secret. We think it's okay to say no to higher health care premiums for our constituents in our home states and for most of the Americans in this country who currently have health insurance. We think it's okay to say no to trillion-dollar spending bills that don't do anything to create jobs. We think it's okay to say no to higher taxes for small businesses and working families that are going to get hit by many of the proposals here that are in front of the Congress, including the health care bill, which, according to the Congressional Budget Office, half of the tax burden, more than half of the tax burden, is going to fall on families making under $100,000 a year. We think it's okay to say no to energy taxes that will kill jobs and wreck the economy. We think it's okay to say no to a $2 trillion expansion of the federal government here in Washington to create a new health care entitlement that will be financed with higher taxes, Medicare cuts, and borrowing from future generations. And we think it's okay to say no to $500 billion in Medicare cuts that are going to impact senior citizens across this country. And it's also okay to say no to the extension of what has become a TARP slush fund, that has become a political slush fund that's now being used for lots of things for which it was not intended. And so I don't apologize for saying no to bad policies that are going to wreck the economy, cost Americans jobs, and put more and more of our future generations at risk because we're saddling them with a burden of debt that they will be carrying forever into the future. And so, Mr. President, I think it's okay for people in this chamber to stand up to bad policies and to say no. And I'm going to continue to defend the right of my colleagues here in the Senate, whether I agree with them or not. A lot of my colleagues on the other side, they have things they want to do. Some of them I don't agree with. That's why we have the United States Senate. It's to come here and to resolve our differences and to try and reach the common ground if that's possible. But if there are bad things that are being proposed, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying no. You're saying no to higher taxes, higher health care premiums, more borrowing, more debt that we're putting on future generations. I don't particularly have a problem with that. I do think it's important, however, that we act on legislation that will create jobs, that will provide a better, stronger economic future for people in this country, and that will address the needs of the people who are hurting because of this economic downturn that we're in. And the legislation we have before us would do just that. And I voted to proceed to that legislation last night so that we could have this debate, so that we could get on this bill, so that we could provide an additional 14 weeks of assistance to people who need unemployment benefits because of what's happening in our economy in this country. I don't think that you'll find a lot of disagreement in here that we need to take those steps that are necessary. Now, I will say that the amendment that was offered by the senator from Nebraska, Senator Joe Hans, is a germane, legitimate amendment that ought to be voted on. All he's simply saying is that if we're going to do this, we ought to figure out a way to pay for it that doesn't lead to higher taxes on small businesses. I think that's a fair vote to have. It's totally related to the underlying bill. But the underlying bill, which would provide and extend unemployment insurance benefits to people in this country who are suffering as a result of the economic downturn, we're not objecting to that. Nobody here is. In fact, we could finish this thing here in the next hour or two if the majority would agree to allow a couple of amendments to be voted on. Now, having said that, I do have an amendment that I think it's important to get a vote on. And the reason it's important to get a vote on it now is because we aren't going to have many more opportunities. The TARP program expires at the end of this year. If Congress doesn't take steps to end it, the Treasury Department can extend it. And the reason that's important, Mr. President, is because the TARP program has gotten far afield from anything it was designed to do. It was designed to stabilize the economy last year at a very difficult time. And so we voted to extend $700 billion in authority for the Federal Reserve and to go out and to buy up some of these troubled assets in various financial firms. They decided to take equity positions, and some of us it was a very, I think, different use of the funds than what many of us had intended when we voted for it. But that being said, it was done to stabilize the financial system in this country. That was a year ago. I think it's fair to say that that's not an emergency anymore. And in fact, many of the TARP funds that have been extended are now being extended to other types of industries. We've seen the auto industry to the tune of about $80 billion come in and get TARP assistance. We've seen insurance companies get TARP assistance. We've even seen TARP assistance made available to help modify home mortgages in this country to the tune of $50 billion, which the Congressional Budget Office says we'll never see any return on. And so the TARP program has become, Mr. President, I hate to call it a political slush fund. I hate to refer to it that way, but at a minimum, it's become a revolving fund that can now be used by the Treasury for all kinds of purposes. And in fact, I think from statements that have been made by the Treasury Secretary, the indications are that they expect to reuse a lot of those funds even after they're paid back by some of the institutions that have gotten assistance. And so you've got the $700 billion TARP fund, TARP authority out there. With payments that have been made back, there's now over $300 billion that is unused. There's about $213 billion that was never used, and with payments that have now come back from some of the institutions who received assistance, there's a little over $300 billion of unobligated funds in the TARP account. Why is that significant? Well, it's significant because if we don't use those funds for some other purpose than for which they were intended, those funds will go to retire the federal debt. To me, that's probably as good of use of funds as we could possibly find right now, because we've got a deficit last year, $1.4 trillion. We're looking at trillion-dollar deficits as far as the eye can see. We're looking, if the Congressional Budget Office predictions are accurate, in the next 5 years we will double the federal debt. In the next 10 years we will triple the federal debt, to the point where every American, every household in this country is going to own $188,000 of debt. So before a young couple starts out, as they get married and start out in their life together, they're going to get a wedding gift from the federal government, a big fat IOU for $188,000. Well, the best thing that we could do right now, in addition to extending unemployment benefits to people who have lost their jobs and whose coverage is running out, is to try and get this debt under control so that we aren't passing on this enormous liability to future generations. And I would argue that if you allow this situation to go unabated, if we continue to borrow money at the rate that we're borrowing it today, and we continue to rack up the kind of debt that we're racking up today, that you're going to create all kinds of economic consequences down the road in the form of perhaps higher interest rates. You could see, I think, inflation pick up down the road. Nobody sees that in the near term, but in the long term, when you start having to print money to monetize your debt, and you're paying back your debt with cheaper dollars, the people who are buying your debt are going to start saying, wait a minute, I want a better return on my investment. And so interest rates start to pick up, and that could have some very disastrous consequences for our economy when it comes to homeowners and small business owners and people who are trying to get student loans. There are all kinds of consequences from this incredible binge of borrowing that we're on as a country. And I think the best thing that we can do, if we've got unobligated funds in the TARP authority right now, is use those funds to pay down that federal debt. Well, that's what my amendment does, and I'm co-authoring it with a senator from the Utah, Senator Bennett. But we believe that we ought to end the TARP authority this year when it's set to expire. If Congress isn't heard on this, then the Treasury has the authority to extend it. Now, I would like to at least have Congress heard on this. Congress, after all, created the TARP fund. Seems to me that if it's going to be extended, that Congress ought to have a vote on that. And as I said, that extension or that expiration date is looming. It's the end of December of this year. And so if Congress is going to be heard, that's going to have to happen in the very near future. And so I would like to see a vote by the United States Senate on whether or not we believe the TARP program ought to be extended, ought to continue to be used for all these other ancillary purposes that I just mentioned that are really unrelated to the underlying purpose for TARP when it was created a year ago. And whether or not we're going to say that we think it's a priority that we start paying down this gargantuan federal debt that is growing by the day, and the interest payments are growing with it. And so I would like to see on this opportunity, this legislation that's moving through here, a vote on whether or not we can extend the TARP program. And my amendment, Madam President, is 1 page. In fact, it's only 4 pages or four lines long. It's very simple. It's here for everybody to take a look at. It won't take very long to figure out what it does. I can't imagine why the majority would not want to have a vote on whether or not we are going to allow a $700 billion authority for the federal government to continue to use these funds. Why Congress would not want to be heard when, in fact, it was the Congress that created this program in the first place. And so my amendment's very simple. All it says is that when the TARP program expires at the end of the year, it ends. Now, that doesn't mean that the Treasury doesn't have the authority to wind down some of the assets and some of the places where it's already invested those TARP dollars. Not at all. All it simply says is the monies that are not expended out of that account will be used to pay down the federal debt, and no additional monies will be extended to other programs or other uses. Now, some people might say, well, what about if we have another emergency? Well, if we have another emergency, Congress can act again. I mean, that's what we do. We're the legislative branch of the government. We have the power of the purse. There isn't any reason to think that if for some reason it became clear that a TARP-like authority was necessary down the road, that the Congress would not take the necessary steps to address that emergency. But in the meantime, we've got a $700 billion fund out there, which as people are making payments back into it, are now going back out. And we've got about $300 billion right now of headroom in that fund, and it seems to me that we ought to take that $300 billion and apply it to paying down the federal debt so that the future generations of Americans are not having their future mortgaged because we haven't been able to live within our means. So it's a 1-page amendment, 4 lines long. The bill that I'm told is being written on health care, which is 1,500 pages. The last version of it that I heard or saw, we haven't seen the current version of it, but that 1,500-page bill is being written behind closed doors. This, on the other hand, is 1 page. It's 4 lines long. It's a very simple, straightforward amendment, and it wouldn't take us but probably a half an hour to debate it and vote on it. And so if the majority doesn't want to have a vote on this amendment, I'm not sure why, because it would seem to me that the United States Senate would want to weigh in on one of the most important issues of the day, and that is whether or not we are going to take some of these unexpended funds and use them, apply them to paying down the federal debt. So with regard to the debate before us, unemployment insurance, it needs to be extended. There's no debate about that. In fact, I think there'll be a big bipartisan vote when it happens. But why wouldn't we? Why wouldn't we, in the interest of having a vote, a fair debate and a vote on amendments, allow amendments like this, which, as I said, because of the expiration date being December the 31st, it's unlikely, in my view, that Congress is going to get an opportunity, if we don't vote on this now, to vote on whether or not a $700 billion expenditure of taxpayer dollars is going to be extended or not. And if, in fact, it served its purpose and it hasn't, then why wouldn't we? Why would we not use that unexpended authority, that unobligated balance, to pay down the federal debt, which I would argue, and I think most Americans would agree, is one of really, truly the most difficult and protracted problems that are going to face the country going forward. And so, Madam President, I guess I would just simply say that this is, in my view, it is related to the debate we're having, because the debate that we're having is about the economy. It's about people who've been displaced and lost jobs, and extending assistance to them, which they need and which we're all supportive of doing. But if you're talking about things that we can do to bring greater stability to the American economy, to provide a better and a brighter and a more secure future for future generations, and to try and get this economy back on track, I think it would be a great message to send to the American people that, okay, the TARP program, which was created for a specific purpose for a specific time, has accomplished that purpose. We don't believe that it ought to become a slush fund for other activities, that the unexpended balances in that fund ought to be used to pay down the federal debt and to provide a better and a brighter future for the taxpayers of tomorrow, unencumbered by a huge mountain of debt that's going to be passed down to them if we aren't able to get our fiscal house in order. So, Madam President, I hope that the majority will come around to the view that let's have a vote, let's have a 30-minute or an hour debate on a couple of these amendments, and let's pass this bill and be done with it. But it seems to me, at least, for some reason, and I'm not sure what that is, but the majority does not want to have a vote on what I think is a very consequential issue of our time and a very consequential issue for the future of this country. Madam President, I yield the floor.